Hi, I'm Lisa Adams, and I'm going to be giving you a lecture on tuberculosis, what I'm subtitling as the other pandemic. So I am the Associate Dean for Global Health at the medical school and the faculty lead for the Global Health Initiative at the Dickey Center and an associate professor in the section of infectious disease and international health. And let's see if I can get my slides up. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to be talking about tuberculosis, the other pandemic, and I'm going to show you some images from the American Red Cross. They're sort of sprinkled throughout the presentation that have public service announcements, and I think it's interesting to think back to these historically because many of the messages that they were conveying decades ago about tuberculosis might now be relevant and similar to some of the public service announcements or placards that we might see relating to COVID. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about TB, the disease, reviewing some of the basics, and where I can, I'll make comparisons to COVID-19. Again, just talking about what causes TB, how is it transmitted, what's sort of the disease process, and that's important to understand when we start talking about what the very rich social history associated with tuberculosis, including the history of the sanatorium movement. And then I don't think we can think about TB either in recent past or current day without thinking a little bit about the stigma associated with tuberculosis. And then I'll just spend a slide or two talking about what we're seeing today with efforts for TB care and prevention, and what has been the impact, or what is the projected impact of COVID-19 pandemic efforts. So again, just some of the basics. What is TB? What causes TB? What does it look like? What is someone who has TB? What symptoms will they present with? How is TB spread? Who gets it? And then what happens if you do get it? So I refer to TB as an ancient disease. We know it's been around for a long time. Some of the earliest evidence that we have of that is that there is evidence of TB having been found in some of the skeletal remains of the early Egyptians. So again, a disease that we know has been with humankind for quite some time. TB is caused by a bacteria, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. This bacteria is an obligate aerobe, meaning that it's an oxygen seeker. It grows most successfully in tissues with a high oxygen content, which of course is our lungs, but very specifically the apices or top parts of the lungs. And I'll show you some pictures of that shortly. Now, TB has very classic symptoms. As I said, it commonly affects the lungs, so it's pulmonary TB. And someone with TB will typically present with cough, with lots of sputum production, and many times coughing up blood as well, or bloody sputum. They may have fevers. They may have sweats at night, and really drenching sweats that often cause people to get up in the middle of the night and have to change the sheets because they have just really soaked through them. And then a progressive loss of appetite leading to weight loss. And let me just compare and contrast this with both COVID and seasonal influenza. I always say, if you were healthy yesterday and you wake up today and you feel feverish and achy and just like you've been hit by a truck and don't want to get out of bed, that's not TB. That could be COVID, or it could be seasonal influenza. TB has much more of this sort of insidious onset with these symptoms sort of waxing and waning. And so you may have some cough and fever and a night or two of drenching sweats, but then you may start to feel a little bit better. And then these symptoms will recur. So it's sort of this waxing, waning course. And so what do? You have these symptoms, but then you start to feel better. So you delay seeking medical attention, right? You think, I'm going to get over this. This is going to pass. I'll give it a little bit more time. And what happens is when people have TB, that's typically their response, and it results in delays in seeking medical care, medical attention, and of course puts their close contacts at risk, because the longer that they delay seeking medical care, the more likely or the more time they have to transmit it to their close contacts, particularly their household contacts. And typically it's weeks to months of someone having symptoms such as these, that again, in that waxing and waning pattern, before they actually do end up in a clinician's office. Now, as I said, the majority of cases are pulmonary TB. It's about 80%. But TB really can affect almost any organ of the body, with lymph nodes and bones being two of the most common. And left untreated, on average, an individual with TB will affect about 10 to 15 people a year. And again, most commonly, their close contacts, namely their household contacts. So how is TB transmitted? Well, it's very clearly airborne transmission. So exposure occurs by sharing a common airspace with a person who is infectious, who is coughing, and aerosolizing the TB bacilli. For all intents and purposes, we will consider only people with TB of the lungs to be infectious. And what happens is when someone coughs, sneezes, talks, or sings, they propel those TB bacilli into the air with the infamous respiratory droplets, right? Concept now that has become a household term. But different from COVID, where we know the respiratory droplets really, when someone coughs or sneezes, go 6 feet or less. And with influenza, that's 3 feet or less. So much shorter distance. With TB, someone coughs, sneezes, sings or talks, and they aerosolize the bacteria that can actually linger in air spaces for up to 8 hours. So if I have TB and I'm coughing in this room, I can leave, someone can come in hours later and become infected. You only need to inhale a very small number of these droplet nuclei that are suspended in the airspace to become infected. So that's very different from COVID too. There is some evidence that there may be some aerosolizing of the virus and that it may linger in air spaces, but that's really not thought to be the predominant means of transmission. But with TB, it is. Then also important to understand is that not all of those individuals infected with TB will become ill with TB disease. So what happens is if you inhale the TB bacilli from these droplet nuclei, a healthy immune system will wall off these TB bacteria, and that they can then lie dormant for years, even your entire lifetime. People will die with TB in this walled off, contained infectious state. And that's called latent TB infection. And interestingly, it's quite common. It affects about 25% of the world's population. So many people aren't aware that that's how common it is, but our prevalence studies indicate that about 25% of the global population has TB in this latent or dormant stage, not evenly distributed across the world, of course, more prevalent in some countries than others, but globally, about a quarter of the world's population. Now, what happens is if a person's immune system becomes weakened, and that could be through infection with HIV, through malnutrition, or through having diabetes. The chances then of progressing from that latent or dormant infection to active TB disease are greater. And that's what increases your risk from progressing from this quieter or dormant infection to having the disease with all the symptoms that I've just talked about. But in general, that happens in a minority of people who are actually infected with TB. Again, a picture here from the Red Cross showing about covering your coughs and sneezes. Again, something that we're seeing as a public service message for COVID today. And then, of course, the infamous backlit sneeze, courtesy of the US CDC. Again, just showing how what a sneeze can really look like, and what a nice propulsion of respiratory droplets it can generate. These are just some pictures by the artist physician Frank Netter. And just to kind of summarize pictorially some of the things we've been talking about. So here's someone with TB, right? They're coughing. The droplet nuclei are suspended in the air, in this case, just for an hour or two. If they're exposed to sunlight, that's great. That will help sterilize the air. And interestingly, in temperate or tropical climates where this is possible, you will see the waiting rooms of TB clinics being outside, right? So there can be good exposure to sunlight and good air circulation. And so that's one of the ways in which we can use nature to our advantage. And then down below in this bottom part of this graphic, you can see some of the organ systems that can be infected or affected by TB, right? So it can of course, affect the gastrointestinal tract. It can affect the pericardium, or the lining of the heart. It can infect the meninges, or the lining of the brain, and then other organs as well, the liver, spleen. It can affect bones, as I've mentioned, your kidneys, etc. So almost any organ, almost every organ has been documented as a potential site for TB infection through dissemination, either through the lymphatic system or through the bloodstream. This is another Frank Netter picture, just showing sort of a lung in cross section and showing these holes in the lung. The TB bacteria actually cause such severe tissue destruction that they actually cause there to be holes in the lung that develop. And what happens is, if these holes become large enough, they can erode into the pulmonary capillaries, and then you can have bleeding into the lungs, and the blood will travel back up the bronchial tree, and that is how you get the coughing up of blood. And this is actually what one of these cavities or holes in the lung looks like on a chest x-ray. So you can see this person here has where the arrow is showing this, and you can see the outline here of this cavity, which with treatment will close over time. But right now, that is actually a hole in that person's lung. So what happens with TB disease if you get it and you're not able to get treatment? Okay, and we have lots of data from the pre-treatment, pre-chemotherapy era. So we know what we call the natural history of TB disease. So at the end of 5 years, a person who has TB disease, if they are not treated, half of them will die. Okay, that's quite a high mortality rate to be associated with a disease. Of the remaining 50%, about 25% will self-cure, become healthy. Now they may have scarring in the lungs, so they may not be perfectly healthy, but they will be free from TB disease. And then the remaining 25% will develop this sort of chronic infectious state where they will again have symptoms sort of on and off for the rest of their life, really never ridding themselves of the TB. And it may eventually kill them, or they may die of something else, but it'll be sort of this chronic, waxing, waning infectious state. The good news is TB is curable with antibiotics, okay? Now, it's complicated to treat TB. It requires a multi-drug combination taken for at least 6 months. You usually start with about 4 drugs and have to, as I say, continue them for at least 6 months. And that is even a longer time period if you have a drug-resistant strain, okay? And then in comparison to COVID, where things have moved so quickly in terms of testing of therapeutics. Now, granted, we're not developing new drugs for COVID. We're repurposing drugs and trying different drugs in combination, but it has moved so much more quickly compared to TB, where we actually have had 2 new drugs in the last 50 years, a much slower drug development process. And then here's another Red Cross picture where you see they're trying to fight TB by keeping this TB Grim Reaper image outside their house on the other side of the door. Okay, just a slide or two about the global epidemiology of TB. So it was in 1993 when the World Health Organization took what was then an unprecedented step of declaring TB to be a global emergency. And now we all know what can happen, what follows after the WHO makes such a proclamation. And certainly we saw that with TB, that since the mid-90s, there has been efforts to really accelerate our response and efforts to control TB globally. But again, we know that still 1/4 of the world's population is infected with TB, most of it in this dormant or latent stage, but still quite a prevalent infection. We know that there are about 10 million new cases of TB disease each year. And again, we can do really well with treating those. If you have drug susceptible TB disease, chances are that 98% chance of being cured. Okay, really quite likely that you will, if you're put on therapy promptly, that you will be cured of your TB. So it's about an 82% successfully treated rate, brought down a little bit by those who have drug-resistant TB, where the cure rates are closer or range between 50 to 70%. Now, interestingly, of those 10 million new cases each year, most of them, or about 2/3, are in just a handful of countries that I've listed here. Obviously, India and China, with their large populations, are often always going to be really at the top of the list, and then some of the other densely populated countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria, etc., and SA is South Africa. So just when you think about where we want to target efforts, it's just really a handful of countries making up the majority of cases. So that really helps us know where we want to focus. Most cases of TB are in the 15 to 54 age group. That is a large age group, I recognize, but what it indicates here is that it affects those in their most economically productive years. And consequently, the economic costs have been devastating, both at the household level, the community level, and the national level. Now, about 1.6 million people die each year from TB. That makes TB the 10th leading cause of death and the first among infectious diseases. So it was about 2 years ago that TB deaths actually exceeded deaths due to HIV. So TB is now the #1 cause of death from an infectious agent. This map from the WHO Global TB Report just shows where cases are concentrated. And again, not surprising, they are concentrated in Southern Africa and to some extent in Southeast Asia as well. And again, the two things that have really thwarted our efforts at TB control have been the emergence of drug resistance and the convergence with the HIV epidemic. So that sort of explains some of the geography. So now I want to shift to talking about the social history of tuberculosis. As I mentioned, there is a very sort of rich and storied social history associated with tuberculosis. So tuberculosis has also been called consumption. It's an older name for TB. And it comes from the Greek word tysis, which means consumption. And that's because of the way that people who developed TB, what they looked like to observers. So it seemed that people who had TB were being consumed from within. They had this sort of bloody cough, which made them very pale, right? As they were often losing significant amounts of blood that way, and also because of their loss of appetite. They weren't eating well. They became very wasted, pale, and feverish. So that's that concept of feeling like they were being consumed from within. And then interestingly, there was a time where artistic creation and the consumptive condition became inextricably linked. Okay? It was Elizabeth Barrett Browning who said, "Is it possible that genius is only scrofula?" And what did they mean by that? Scrofula being the name for TB of the lymph nodes. It was recognized at the time that maybe TB is just the price that artists paid for their talents. Okay? It was also said that in the consumptive patient, the mind and body were imagined as existing at odds with one another. So even as the body became consumed and wasted by disease, the mind was then freed to expand and create. So a very interesting association and imagery there with how TB and artistic creativity and talent were associated. So the impact of TB was seen particularly in Europe, or at least that's the documentation that we have, is from Europe throughout the ages. We have much less information about how it impacted countries and communities in Asia and in Africa. It surely did, but most of what we have is information from Europe. So we know that it claimed the life of many a king and queen and heir, and by the mid-19th century, it accounted for about 25% of all deaths in Europe. It's astounding if you think of it. 25% of the people that died, that you would know that died, would die from TB. And this is just a picture of King Louis XIII, who succumbed to TB in his early 40s. When you think about the artists and poets and writers that were affected, I mean, from the Bronte sisters to Chopin to Voltaire, all of these individuals struggled with or were either affected with and developed TB, and and of course, many artist, poet, musician, writer succumbed to TB as well. So it was in 1882 that the Mycobacterium tuberculosis was actually identified by Robert Koch as the cause of TB. And there's a picture of Robert Koch looking at the TB bacilli under his microscope. It would be another 60 years before we actually had any effective antibiotics against the TB bacteria. The first being a drug called streptomycin, and that was shortly followed by isoniazid. Now, streptomycin is one that we don't use today. There's quite a bit of resistance to it anyways. It's also a very toxic drug. But isoniazid is still one of the most commonly used drugs today. So again, when I talk about that slow progression of both drug and diagnostic development, that's another example. And then just another sidebar, since I have Robert Koch there with his microscope, looking for the TB bacteria in a sputum sample by putting that sputum sample on a microscope slide and staining it appropriately. That was the primary means of diagnosing TB in low and middle income countries until just about 10 years ago. Again, so we always say that we had for 100 years, we used the same, over 100 years, we used the same diagnostic tool that Robert Koch used. Fortunately, now we have advanced, and we have nucleic acid amplification test technology that can be used, but it's taken us a long time to get there. So again, and I think about the accelerated pathways and what's been done with COVID testing, it's quite impressive. So I want to just switch now to talking about the sanatorium movement, which is also part of the history of tuberculosis. So this notion, and I'll talk about where it came from, that rest and mountain air and good nutrition would have a beneficial effect on tuberculosis emerged and really took hold. Interestingly, this was really based on personal anecdotes and unscientific ideas about the nature of the disease. And I'll just make a note of how we're seeing some of that happening today with COVID. And again, just reference to where the word sanatorium comes from, the word sanare, to cure or to heal. And then again, another good public health message from some decades ago: fight tuberculosis, obey the rules of health. That would be guidance I would still hope we're adhering to today, even if it might be fight COVID, obey the rules of health. So just a little bit of the history here. It was in 1791 when an unknown London physician observed that fishermen who were out in their boats all day didn't seem to be susceptible to tuberculosis of the lymph nodes, which I've already said is also referred to as scrofula. So based on that, they established the Royal Free Bathing Infirmary for Scrofula, Margate, and that became the first institution for open air treatment of TB, saying it must be something about that fresh air, again, based on observation only. About 60 years later in Eastern Europe, Hermann Bremer established the Institution for the Treatment of TB in the Mountains. Now, why did he do that? Well, this was based on his own personal experience of recovering from TB after a trip to the Himalayas, where he was exposed to sun, air, cold, and plentiful food, healthy food. And then within the next 2 decades, that mountain rest and sanatorium movement was established throughout Europe. Now, back in the US, it was Edward Livingston Trudeau who started the sanatorium movement. So similarly, based on personal experience and an N of 1, Trudeau had developed TB in medical school, and when he relapsed some years later, he went to the Adirondacks to recover. And he was convinced that it was that fresh mountain air that was beneficial. And in 1884, built the first sanatorium in the US at Saranac Lake in upstate New York. So any of you are from upstate New York or at any point traveling through upstate New York, there is it's been converted into a museum, and it's definitely worth a visit if you are so inclined. And these are just some pictures of it as well, and some of the cottages that were associated with the sanatorium. So this idea of the fresh, cold air was really taken to heart. And here are I'll just show some pictures now of what this really looked like. So here you see a nurse reading to children who are wrapped in blankets because they are out in the wintertime on an open air porch. So that's what getting fresh air looked like. It gets even a little bit more dramatic when you look at this outdoor cure taken to the extreme of children in their sort of diapers and just cloths playing outside in the snow, and they seem to be happy, knowing how my kids didn't like to wear their winter coats in the winter. These kids seem delighted to be able to play out in the snow, wearing just a cloth diaper. So they don't seem too miserable, but I can imagine that would depend on how long they had to be outside. So again, the scientific support for the benefits of rest and fresh air really never came about. The experiment that we know about that's been documented is one by Trudeau, in which he took 10 rabbits, inoculated them with TB, and then 5 were given fresh air, sunshine, and food, and 4 of them survived. And the other 5 were kept in a trench and underfed, and only 1 survived. So that was essentially the scientific evidence or basis for their beliefs about what fresh air, sunshine, and good food would do. Now, certainly, good food would be, we all would agree, would probably lead to better healing. But there really was not much evidence for the fresh air, particularly that cold mountain air. That just was never substantiated. But in 1901, the New Hampshire legislature authorized the sanatorium, and that was at a time when the death rate from TB hit about 200 per 100,000, quite a high death rate. And again, it was at the time the most common cause of death for young people between the ages of 20 and 40. So pretty devastating impact across populations. So I often ask if anybody has climbed Mount Moosilauke, and I hope you're all nodding your head that you have, and if you haven't, you absolutely should. This is the New Hampshire State Sanatorium at Glencliff, New Hampshire, when it was a sanatorium. I guess this picture of the men's ward specifically, and this some of these buildings or the site still exists, and it's now actually the Glencliff home for the elderly, which you can see if you're driving by or taking one of the routes up Moosilauke. So again, fresh air, rest, cold, good food, those were the early therapies. There were some other things that were tried a little bit more drastic, such as putting air in the chest to create a collapse of the lung. Again, anecdotal and small amount of animal data suggested that you could improve outcomes in those with TB if you did collapse the lung, the idea being that you would sort of suffocate the bacteria. And so apparently thousands of these therapeutic injections of air that cause the lung to collapse were performed at Glencliff, and some people were received it more than once. And again, it was effective in some portion of the patients, especially if the disease was only limited to one lung, but still not a very impressive success rate. The other thing too that was done was removing of ribs to try to collapse the lung that way. And again, just more pictures here where you can see these beds lined up on this outdoor porch, right? That's going right to the outside. And then because people went to the sanatorium and stayed for years and sometimes decades, it also became places where children grew up, young adults learned a trade, and this is a class, a picture of a class in occupational therapy, and they became furniture makers, right? So that they did develop some skills and trades. So interestingly, from the early 19th century, where TB had this romantic affliction, right? It was associated with being a talented musician or artist. It was in the 20th century where TB became an embarrassment. Then it became associated with factory work and malnutrition, overcrowded living conditions, and poor hygiene. It became associated with being a disease of the urban poor. It made individuals, particularly women, ineligible for marriage, and others unsuitable for hire. So there's certainly, you can say, a stigma that persists today with tuberculosis. And I guess it's an open question, is it better or worse than it was at that time? So I'm just going to finish up with two last slides, and again, talking about TB care and prevention during the COVID pandemic. So we all know that our global, and particularly our US, and certainly in the state of New Hampshire, our response to COVID by doing things like physical distancing, staying at home, the closing of bars and restaurants, has led to a slowing of the spread of COVID. We also know that, again, particularly in countries with high TB burdens, it's also causing serious disruptions to control of other major diseases. So the Stop TB Partnership, based in Geneva, came together with colleagues from Imperial College, Avenir Health, which is an NGO that does disease modeling as one of their key activities, Johns Hopkins University and USAID, to conduct this modeling study. And they tried to answer two questions. First, they were trying to answer, what is the potential 5-year impact of the short-term lockdowns on TB incidence being new cases in a year, and TB mortality in some of the high TB burden countries? The second question they tried to answer is, following these lockdowns, how can countries accelerate the restoration of their TB programs to bring the TB burden back under control? And they focused on data from India, Kenya, and Ukraine, and modeled for those countries, and then they extrapolated to create global estimates. And what they found was that globally, a 3-month lockdown with a 10-month restoration period would lead to 6.3 million additional TB cases between now and over the next 5 years, and 1.4 million additional TB deaths. Okay, these are on top of the deaths and cases of TB that we would be seeing with the status quo. They also concluded that recovery will require supplementary measures and additional resources to reduce this accumulated pool of people with TB, and that may include things like ramping up active case finding of individuals with TB and intensive community engagement doing contact tracing to maintain awareness about the importance of recognizing and responding to TB symptoms. Now, post-COVID, some of these resources that have been used for COVID may be able to be redeployed to TB, especially when you think about the contact tracing. Individuals who have that skill set may be able to be redeployed for the TB effort. But again, there's going to be a significant amount of catch-up to sort of return to, to the status of where we were pre-COVID, because we're going to have significant losses. And these are just two graphs that show, the first one on the left shows the monthly rate per 100,000, and it's covered under the left shows, yes, TB case rates or incidence, and the right shows TB deaths. And so the blue line here is the status quo baseline with a sort of slow, decline over this 2020 to 2022. And the red line shows what we will see in terms of TB cases, new cases with a 2-month lockdown and a 2-month restoration. And then the yellow line shows a 3-month lockdown with a 10-month restoration. And again, you can just see these are excess, in this case is excess case and excess deaths, shown by these two lines. Above the status quo, if we are experiencing a lockdown of a few months, and then depending on the period of restoration. And again, it's interrupted services. It could be interrupted drug supply, pipelines, and people being afraid to and not seeking care appropriately. So again, some projected significant impact, and trying to figure out how to mitigate this negative impact. That's something that we're all thinking about. So again, in summary, we talked about tuberculosis, the other pandemic, this airborne bacterial disease, which is curable. However, it's been around for a long time, and it still persists today with significant disease burden and deaths. And again, I've mentioned why some of our control efforts today are thwarted by the fact that it exists in this latent form, and we don't always know who's going to progress to active TB disease. There is treatment for the latent form, but it's not widely used or available in low and middle income countries. And then, of course, the emergence of drug-resistant strains and convergence with the HIV epidemic are all ways in which impacts that have affected or thwarted our efforts to control TB. Talked about the social history, its association with artistic talent, and then the history of the sanatorium movement. And again, how this was really all based on observational data, never based on good science. And if there's one message I have to leave you with, we need to let science lead us to making good policy decisions, good treatment decisions, develop the best practices for TB and for COVID. And then again, just a thought about the stigma of tuberculosis. Is it past or present? Is it something that we know it's something that we're still tackling today? And then again, just the last couple of slides showing the significant impact of the COVID-19 pandemic response on TB care and prevention, and how it can result in a loss of the gains that we've experienced with controlling TB over the last 5 to 8 years. So I'll end it there, and I hope this has been a good fit with the rest of your class on the history of epidemics, and I wish you a successful end to your term.